Hello, comic creators. Welcome back to the Comics Experience podcast where we talk to you about the business and creative aspects of being a professional comic book creator. I'm Gamal. The gentleman virtually next to me is Andy. And today we are talking about the ongoing saga of well, the ongoing saga that is 2025 so far in the comic book industry. Most specifically, we're going to be talking about what's happening in the editorial community for certain comic book publishers and what's going on and how it affects you, how it affects them, and what it is that you can do to kind of deal with this situation. So, just as a little bit of background, over the past 2 weeks, I guess since we recorded our last podcast, four companies have announced editorial layoffs from their employee staffs. We have Alien, Ablaze, Dark Horse, and IDW all announced layoffs within the past 2 weeks. Now, this has not been confirmed, but it comes on the heels of both the Diamond Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing and the ongoing threat of possible tariffs on both raw materials like paper for comic books and the finished goods coming from certain countries like China, South Korea, which actually produce significant amounts of comics that are consumed in the United States, at least on the print side. So while there is not
Quick correction, there are no tariffs being threatened on South Korea at the moment.
at the moment, the
China
reason I
and
put
Canada,
yes,
well, I
China,
mean,
yes,
it can happen, but the last time we went through a raft of tariffs, South Korea was not hit, which is important because you can print there and not get hit by tariffs, at least for now.
at least for now. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, we are specifically the countries that were named in the possible tariffs are Canada, where a significant amount of both paper and printed comics come from, and China, where there's also a significant amount of both paper and printed comics. The tariff situation is in flux. The Diamond bankruptcy is not in flux. It is actually an ongoing thing that is currently happening in the comic book industry. So while co coincidence is not causality, so it is not automatically the case that the reason that all of these editorial layoffs going on are the results of Diamond and the possible tariffs. But since they are coming kind of directly on the heels of each other, they may or may not have some role in it. But that's not really the important part of what it is that I wanted to talk about. Andy, what I wanted to kind of get from you is the impact of how losing this much editorial staff from companies like IDW and Ablaze, how that's going to affect them in terms of the books they have coming out, the projects they already had, in the pipeline, what they might acquire next. As a publisher, how does the that turnover in staff or those layoffs affect those kind of things?
Well, I think it depends on kind of what you're wanting to do as a publisher. Like some of them might be like, hey, now's the time to tighten the belt and they're just going to trim costs and maybe they're looking to put out a fewer titles but keep the ones that sell better. I mean, most publishers kind of go through those sorts of cycles just naturally, even if the economy and everything is relatively steady, and we don't have major distributors going out of business. Like
Mhm.
that's a fairly natural cycle. So that in and of itself, doesn't really worry me. Most of the layoffs um, are are we're talking about relatively small numbers of editors that are laid
Right.
off at each of these places. I mean, they are on a spectrum, um, but um, but that's my guess is you probably have a bit of tightening the belt because like there's a lot of uncertainty right now for all the reasons you just said. Um, so there's nothing in those layoffs that makes me think, oh, they're out, right? They're
Mhm.
they're they're going out of business or anything like
Mhm.
that. But they're recalibrating for new realities. And unfortunately, that's the fallout is one like the major place that you can cut costs as a publisher is in your overhead. Like
Mhm.
that's which means for the most part, people, you could move to a smaller facility with a cheaper rent. Like there are other things too, but um, but yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what we're seeing. I certainly, as you know, if I were a publisher looking for an editor, because there may very well be some publishers out there that are looking to fill some roles.
Mhm.
I wouldn't look at any of these layoffs in these last 2 weeks, or even prior to that, as necessarily as evidence that they aren't good at what they do. Like, I
Right.
mean, probably what we're seeing are editors who are good at what they do, but the landscape is not good. So, if I were on the other side of this and I was at a publisher that was like actually was in the process of bulking up on staff, I think I'd be going, hey, this actually might be a really good time
Hmm.
to scoop up um, talented editors. But yeah, I don't know that. Um, yeah, like I said, I don't see this as like these companies are on some sort of impending doom list or anything like that. We've seen with IDW, they've had some losses for going back a ways now, but again, they also rake in quite a lot of money. Like their revenue streams is in the it's a lot of millions. So
Hmm.
there are ways to cut costs and refine that. I think they'd be able to weather this. Um, Likely. And then, Dark Horse has been sort of purchased, and, the parent companies are doing things and restructuring things, and that always means layoffs. I don't know what the health of the overall company is because it's way bigger than Dark Horse. So it's very difficult, to say in a case like that. Um, they had a higher number of layoffs, although not most of them were not in editorial, as I understand it. I'm not 100% sure. I haven't gotten that confirmed, but um, you might see something like that, especially if most of the layoffs are in the higher levels
Hmm.
as preparing to sell, a company if they wanted to sell Dark Horse off or something like that. But again, that's one item that might lead one to believe that. So again, that's not something I think is actually likely to happen right now, but you never know.
Hmm. Well, there's two actual points that I wanted to kind of dig into based on your answer. The first one is if you're a creator or creative team that was trying to looking to get a deal with one of these publishers, and you maybe the connection that you had to those companies was the editor who was kind of shepherding that project through. When the editor moves, and this is not just for the current situation, this is for, anytime you're trying to get a creator-owned licensing deal, how should you respond as the creator if the editor that you were kind of talking to get you in the door there is suddenly not there? What should be your next step? You're silent. I don't
Okay.
know
Sorry. I
why.
would talk with the editor. I mean, that would be step one, is see how they feel about potentially continuing on the project or helping you get the project placed, even if it's with the company they just left, because there may be a scenario where, depending on how far along it was, other people at that company may have liked it,
Hmm.
not really feel comfortable reaching out to you, but maybe this editor could go back and say like, hey, I still really want to do this project. You guys all liked it. Do you want to do it? And then you could just hire me as a freelance editor for the one project. So you're not hiring the person back full time. They're freelance. It's a whole different tax revenue thing.
Hmm.
So, so there might actually be some business there that editor might really appreciate. Also, I'm sure they would love to hear that you enjoyed working with them and would like to
Right.
continue to do so. Failing that, there's also a scenario where they may come on board on the project for pay, or maybe even back end, and they're trying to help you, use their connections at other publishers that they likely have to
Right.
place it somewhere else as well. And then you could again wind up. So you could really be doing that editor a favor and doing yourself a favor because you get to continue. There's the continuity of editorial that way.
Right.
Now, another publisher that they take it to may say, we have our own editor. We'd like to take it, in which case, you need to find some way to compensate your editor that helped place it. Or at least I would hope that you would.
Right. Now, in the case where you were, you were shopping things around and the editor showed interest, but then the editor got let go, do you kind of just, do you try, would it make sense to try to either bring on the editor yourself as like a freelance editor, or to try to see where that editor lands and then try again to get that editor to kind of take a look at the book to pick it up at their new spot? Or do you try to, that editor left the, let's say, let's use Dark Horse as an example. The editor leaves Dark Horse. Do you still try to go through Dark Horse even though the editor that you did have a connection with is gone?
Yes, to
Ah.
all of it. So I mean, ultimately, as the creators on a project that you own, like your number one priority has to be to the project.
Right.
That's actually something I tell editors too, that your number one priority has to be to the project as well. But in this case, yeah, I'd still talk to whatever company I was talking to, but I would reach out to the editor. I mean, hopefully you've got some way to contact them. I'd reach
Mhm.
out to the editor and talk to them. Do you want to still be, if you want them to still be involved, I would have that conversation and say, do you think we can take it to somewhere else? Do you think we can do that? Or if you land somewhere else, I'd love to continue with you. I think you've earned it.
Mhm.
Um, you're not under any kind of legal contractual obligation
Right.
that I can think of anyway. I am not a lawyer and I'm not giving legal advice.
Good
Um,
job. Good job.
uh, but I just think that's sort of the the common decency thing to do would be to at least have that conversation. If nothing else, take the time to thank them for their time and interest, even if nothing else comes from that. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
being kind to other people and respectful doesn't cost you anything really.
Yep. And in the long term, it will be helpful because as we've noted several times, the comic book industry is very small. The person who gets laid off from an editorial job today may be in a much better position like a year and a half from now. And if you have a good relationship with them already, then that cannot hurt you. Let's talk a little bit. If you're an independent publisher, you're not trying to get a book placed at like a Dark Horse or an IDW, but you know how important editorial support is because you listen to this podcast, and we've talked several times about how important it is to have an editor. And you see these fairly high profile editors hit the market under, how would you go about if you said, okay, I've got a project, I know I'm publishing it myself, while this really, experienced editor is now, on the streets, how do you go about kind of recruiting them to your project?
Well, I mean, that really depends on the financial state of that smaller publisher, right?
Right.
So like I had one or two opportunities with CEX, which was totally funded by me to work with some great editors, but I really didn't have the funds to pay them properly.
Right.
Um, and we tried to work it out a couple of times, and ultimately, right, it wasn't a great fit because they weren't being compensated properly.
Right.
And I wasn't able to, and I was upfront about that, and had we grown a lot, then maybe that could have changed, but
Hmm.
that was sort of the reality. So I would just caution. I don't think I mean, there's certainly no bad blood on my end. That I don't think there's any bad blood on anyone else's end either. But it's an uncomfortable situation at best when somebody has to pull away for that reason.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and in hindsight, I learned a lot of lessons being a publisher for a couple of years. Um, one of the lessons I learned was if you can't pay them out of the gate what their current market value or potential is, or whatever the right term is, um, it's probably best not to try to make that work out.
Right.
So in lieu of just hiring them full time and then trying to figure it out from there,
Hmm.
I think I'd go back to like, hey, if you bring us projects, I can pay you to edit the project. I can't bring you on full time, but I can pay you. And then, and maybe there's a finder's fee. So even if
Right.
they bring a project, but they can't stay on and edit it, maybe you can pay them a finder's fee because one of the things that editors have is a lot of connections to creators. So a lot of times they hear about projects. Like there's a lot of projects that get announced at publishers all over the place that I've known about. And I'm really happy to see them get placed, even if I couldn't take them at CX or they didn't fit our profile or whatever,
Mhm.
and so and we all kind of talk a lot. And just this morning I had a conversation with a writer who's right on the cusp of sort of turning, having a key point in her career
Mhm.
turn. And so I was talking to her and said, if she's got pitches or things to send to that she needs to get around, but she lives overseas, doesn't have as good access, can't go to the shows in the US, send them to me. And if I know, because I know her and I know how good she is, if I know places that I think these would fit at and I know people there, then I'll pass them along. That kind of thing is not that uncommon.
Mhm. Mhm.
That editors, even between companies, I think when you're on staff somewhere, maybe you don't do that as much, but you
Right.
might be like, take this over to so and so.
Mhm.
Like you may not facilitate it yourself, but like you might be like, I think you could find something here or there, and you can tell them I said so. That kind of a thing happens. So one of the things that's nice about the comics industry is that there is on some level this community that we all want each other to succeed enough that the whole thing doesn't collapse. And right
Right.
now, it feels like, whether this is actually true or not, it feels like the whole thing could collapse with Diamond going
Right.
under.
Right, right. Well, what when I mentioned the independent publisher bringing on like these experienced editors, I should have made it clear that I was talking about on a per project basis, not on a full-time basis. So
Yeah,
that,
and then so one of the things that I've found is that's really hard to price out as an
mm,
editor because I don't know how much time it's going to
okay.
take, how many revisions on scripts, or how many art, how long it's going to take me to go over the layouts and get new layouts and all that sort of stuff. So that's really hard to like quantify on a time level. At Comics Experience, we have a service where you can contract with us, and if you've got a script, we can do the art, the coloring, the lettering. We can do the legal paperwork to make sure it's all yours. We can put the whole thing together. That's actually a little bit easier to do from sort of a like a budgeting standpoint
Mhm.
because you can sort of do aggregates over time. And we've been doing it for over 10 years. So we've got a pretty good handle. Some projects are going to require more time and maybe they're, technically less profitable. Some might go more smoothly. So when you aggregate them kind of that way, and across disciplines, it's a little bit easier to make financial sense. But if it's just like one thing here, one thing there, it can be difficult to uh to like budget that out or put a put an estimate or a bid out.
Mm, okay. I think the last question I want to ask is from the perspective of these editors themselves, who, like we've already discussed, they have a lot of connections. If they're experienced, they, probably have a significant pool of talent that they can reach out to for any given potential project. How feasible is it for some of these editors to kind of set up their own, I guess, for want of a better word, creative services shop where people bring them the script or the initial idea, and then they price out, well, I will edit it and I will bring in the artist and the letterer and the colorist, and I will bring in the production designer so that they can set up something for themselves to kind of start a business based on the skills and resources that they have.
How difficult is it to set that up?
Mhm.
It's not that difficult, I think, to set it up. Like, I mean, you could get a website domain name and sort of list the services you provide. Like you could get that all done. And you could even start, even if you just use PayPal, you could start
Mhm.
taking payments pretty easily. Stripe would probably be better for credit cards and things like that.
Mhm.
But you can kind of add those on as you go, make things a little bit easier, run more smoothly. You can also, fairly easily get a business, EIN number and that sort of thing with the
Mhm.
Secretary of State. That's not terribly expensive and not that difficult to get. Once you form a company, that takes a little bit more time, but you could get started and then kind of do those things kind of on a rolling basis.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and then, but the thing that I think is the most difficult is budgeting it. And if somebody were to do that, what I would recommend is, because here's some of the roadblocks I hit when I first started doing it. Somebody come in and be like, I have a 96-page graphic novel I want to do, and then I would price out doing the whole thing and be like,
Mhm.
okay, well, you can just pay, we'll pay at these milestones. And then at some point they'd be like, yeah, I'm really not that into this for whatever reason, or I don't think it's going to work out or whatever. And then they just stop. And I've done all this legwork to figure out all this stuff. I've hired creators and now I have to go back to them and be like, oh, this whole thing is over. So like it creates this nightmare. So one of the things that I would start with, starting small, is you can pay me and I'll just be on an hourly retainer.
Right. Mhm.
And that way you're paying for what you use and it takes the time that it takes. I try to be efficient.
Mhm.
And I would do things too where I'd be like, look, if you're going to pay me for 10 hours a month, let's say,
Right.
of editorial, that when I'm approaching the 10 hours, if it's 2 weeks in,
Mhm.
I'll let you know, like, hey, we're here and we're likely going to go over by the end of the month. Is that okay? And they have the option of saying no, wait till next month or whatever. So protecting yourself by not doing too much on the front end or trapping yourself in a long-term contract and then finding, oh, this took 5 times longer than I thought, which has happened
Mhm.
to me. And so really you're making 20% what you thought you were making.
Right.
Those are the things that are really difficult. So I'd kind of recommend sort of an hourly thing. One of the things that's nice about Comics Experience is we handle all that paperwork and we hire the creators, which means we go to the creators and we say, we're guaranteeing your payment for this when we
Mhm.
hire you. So that gives the creators a lot more confidence to work with us because even if the client splits for whatever reason, they still get paid.
Right.
So we're kind of acting as an insurance agent, which allows for creators to work with us with more confidence. But I wouldn't start there. We built to that.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
started there, got burned, and then did the next thing I was saying about starting hourly and then kind of rebuilding until we had a cushion and we could, we could mitigate that risk a
Mhm.
lot
Mhm.
better. But I think it's great. Like I love the fact that I get to edit all kinds of stuff from, that's very, different than working at Marvel. It's all superheroes. With what I do now, I get to work across multiple genres, multiple age groups. I get to do all kinds of different and fun stuff, and all of them have their challenges that are interesting, and all of them have the things that are a nuisance, and that's all part of it. But I like it, and I like the variety.
Okay. Okay. All of that makes sense. So I think just to wrap this discussion up in a central thought, the idea that editorial movement in publishing companies, for whatever reason that they might occur, actually creates various situations and opportunities that you can take advantage of or, kind of work with if you're looking for a creator-owned deal, if you're in an independent publisher, and if you are an editor yourself and you're trying to like figure out what to do as a possible next step. There are a lot of things that you could actually do to pivot. And so I guess the final word on it is these layoffs in these various companies do not necessarily mean the end for the companies. They don't necessarily mean the end for the editors. And there could be opportunities for independent and emerging publishers to get quality editorial support because these people are now available. So, um, a lot of the links to the stories about the layoffs will be in the show notes. There will also be links for you guys to check out Comics Experience and what we are offering on that side. So until next time, I'm Gamal. He's Andy. Have fun with your comics.